Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 31st chapter in the book of Job. We took it to the midway point, verse 20. We're going to cover the second half, verses 21 through 40, and this is the sixth and final chapter of Job's ninth and final speech. Beginning in the 26th chapter, he responds to Bildad, then in the 27th, he responds to the comforters, his collectors, somewhat misleadingly named. Then in verse 28, we read of an unusual interval, hymn to divine wisdom that has no reference point to Job's experience or anything else that's going on. But the 29th chapter, so in all likelihood, the 28th chapter was written by the author of Job. Who that was, the only thing we do know is that it wasn't Job himself. Because the author and the reader alone are privy to the scenes and machinations of the first two chapters, which are foundational to the story which unfolds. But Job definitely picks up the monologue again in the 29th chapter, and he is looking back with fond nostalgia to a life that once was, his glory days, his golden age, the peak of his prime, which was so... It seems like just yesterday, and not a whole lot of time has elapsed since he lived this life. But then he describes his degraded and ruined condition in the 30th, his present predicament, all these things that he once had, he no longer has. And even though he had been there to help out others who were bereft of helpers, now that he was bereft of anyone to help, there was no one to help him. And in the 31st chapter, this is the sixth and final chapter of his ninth and final speech, he gives a list of all these things that he has done and all these things he has not done. So he closes his case with an appeal, an ironclad certainty of his own integrity. The first of these things that he says is in verse 1, "I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a maiden with lust?" A covenant or a vow is a very serious thing. I would not recommend making a similar covenant. I would not make a similar one for myself, because as much as you try to discipline the urge to look lustfully at women, it does sneak up on you all the time. But Job was righteous enough to take a vow. He was asking, now if you take a vow, that means you are giving a promise to God that you will fulfill your end of the bargain. So that means Job could never ogle at a pretty woman. And it's okay to admire a woman's beauty from a distance, but the lustful look, which is the substitute of the act, that is the moral equivalent of adultery. It's the adultery of heart of Matthew 5:28. But Job didn't do that stuff, and we just have to remember that we are saved by God's promises to us and not our promises in him. If you want to make a vow, make it, there was a Nazirite vow that was a 30-day period. It wasn't a lifelong thing, but Job at one point in his life had entered into such an arrangement. He had entered into a vow, and he had not broken it. Verse 4, "Does he not see my ways and number all my steps?" Job still has ironclad certainty that there is an all-seeing, all-knowing eye in the sky who is privy to every movement and machination in life and in his universe. But he wants to know, why is he so distant? Why can he not feel him? Why is he not protecting him? Why is he harming him? Job has done nothing to deserve this, but he does have faith that there is one who does see all, know all, and he can perhaps vindicate him. Because and in the fifth verse, we witness the beginning of verses that begin in if. So we witness a lot of if then exchanges. So if I have done or not done this thing, then let this curse come upon me. Verses 5 and 6. "If I have walked in falsehood, or in my foot had hurried to deceit, let him weigh me in the right scale, and let Eloah know my integrity." Walking in falsehood, that's just trafficking lies, living deceit, imposing facades. There are any number of ways in which we can walk in falsehood, and if our feet, deceit has a lure and a pull, and we have to resist it. But Job had the ironclad certainty. He had the assurance of his own integrity. This he stubbornly clung to, and he knew that he had integrity, and he knew that God knew that he had integrity, and he knew that God knew that Job had not sinned to the proportion of the severity of his suffering, but he just wanted an answer. He wanted an audience. He does another one in verses 7 and 8, 9, and 10. He says, "If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over him." So he takes the moral equivalent of adultery to such a serious extent that he says that if he violated the vows that he had made with his eyes, with his God, that his eyes shall not gaze on a maiden or a woman in lust. So if he's physically creeping around his neighbor's property to find out when the man of the house isn't home so he could go in and just have that even mindset, he is willing to surrender the sexual exclusivity with his own wife, let someone literally have adulterous affairs with a wife, if I even so much think of having adulterous affairs with another man's wife. And then he says this in verse 12, just kind of describing the lust. This is the emotion that he speaks so much on. "For that would be a fire that burns to destruction and take root among all my increase." Lust is an all-consuming passion that just overwhelms and overpowers, and it spreads like fire. There's really a lot of explosive potential, but it all does not end well. It ends in destruction and ruin and hurt. And so Job is saying he wants to get away from it because he knows what it does. And then he says, if I had ever treated my servants unfairly or harshly, he says, then I deserve the punishment. But then he says something remarkable about the equality of the image bearers in humanity. Verse 15, "Did not he who make me make in the womb make him, and did not the one fashion us in the womb? The rich, the poor, the master and servant, they bear the common fingerprint of the same creator." So we are all endowed with the image, and even though we are not equal in talents and in station in life, we are equal in the sense that we all belong and are precious and are the prize crown glory of the Creator's creation. So whether you are rich, poor, servile, or dominant, you have the same intrinsic equality. And, he just says, if I abuse the poor, the fatherless, the orphans, he was a father. He considered himself a father to the poor and those without. And if I have seen anyone perish for lack of garments, or poor ones without coverings. So we'll just read we'll begin with the 19th, the 20th, and then we'll read the 21st verse to launch the lesson itself, just because this begins the if exchange. Verse 19, "If I have seen anyone perish for lack of garments, or a poor one without covering, if his loins have not blessed me, if he warmed himself with the fleece of my sheep." This marks the lesson we already covered, 21 lesson itself. "If I have raised my hand against the fatherless, when I saw I had help in the gate, let my arm fall from my shoulder, and let my arm be broken from the bone." The orphans, now the justice system, the thing about orphans is they were so vulnerable and so exploitable because they didn't have a fatherly figure to protect them, to provide for them, to raise them. They were literally on their own, and a single mother in those days, a widowed mother, would not be able to provide in the same ways that a father could. So it was people like Job, people who had the amount to make the difference in people like theirs lives, who really stepped up and defended them and provided them when they had help in the gate. The gate is the center of commerce and judgment. Job was a man of influence and prominence in his local city of Uz. He was an Edomite. But he's saying if I had ever done these things, these easy to do things, easily excusable, often because they are so exploitable, and everyone does it because they have the leverage to do it. Job does not say that, "Let my arm fall from my shoulders and my arm be broken from the bones." So the arm which steals, he would rather enter the afterlife with that maimed. This is consistent with much of the Savior's teachings in the Gospels. It's better to be a maimed sinner than better to be a maimed saint than a healthy sinner. So if your eyes are prone to lust, poke them out. But really, just everything is a heart matter. So remove the disposition in your heart. But if you cannot control the lust of your eyes, or your hands are a thief, or your mouth tells lies, he says to just physically mutilate them. You're going to be better off in eternity without these organs and members that are liable to sin. For I am in the dread of destruction from El, and from his excellence I could not escape. So he feels surrounded and overwhelmed and overpowered by the sovereign, omnipotent deity. He has a special vendetta against Job, and Job cannot quite figure out for the life of him what it is he has done to deserve even the unprecedented calamity that just befell him literally in the twinkle of an eye. But he's just acknowledging the excellence, the honor, the reverential respect that is inescapable to any worshiper of Elohim. It's an inescapable conclusion, and no matter how much times he may defy the description of what he is always in and of himself what he always is. If I could put my trust in gold, or called fine gold my refuge. So riches, Job had riches, but riches were not his God. He was able to control wealth. He was able to have possessions without being possessed by them. Riches in themselves, it is not sinful to be wealthy. It is sinful to love wealth, and you can be poor and money can still be your God. And in such a case, you are in more dangerous spiritual terrain than the rich man who has wealth but can handle it. And the danger of wealth is that it poses the illusion and the deceit. It's truly deceitful because it poses as a panacea, an end-all, be-all cure to everything in the world, but it cannot prevent death, and it cannot make one happy. It cannot provide the ultimate satisfaction, and we cannot take any with us when we gone. So it not only cannot prevent death, but it is of no value in the life which awaits us. So if you're on a fool's errand, if your life is consisting of consuming and enjoying as much as you can, and you cannot serve Elohim and Mammon, it's got to be one or the other, and Job was clearly in the corner of Elohim. If I have rejoiced because my wealth was great, and because my hand had gained much. Job had prospered financially, and he was successful because of his reputation for honesty in business transactions. He did not amass his wealth unfairly, and this reputation ultimately rendered him a man to do business with. He would have been respected in the spiritual community and also in the business community, and just all across society. But he did not. He could have wealth without being tempted by it, without succumbing to its lure, succumbing to its traps, buying its deceptions, just not resisting the indulgence and what it is. So he had great wealth and he could handle it, but he did not boast in the wealth because he knew that it was not by his own resources or efforts. Everything he had, he considered a gift from God. If I have looked at the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in brightness, these would have been things to do in the ancient Near East. Entire cultures worship the stars and the suns and the heavenly bodies, and that rather than the one who made them. So Job was not a Hebrew, he was an Edomite, but the Hebrews were distinct from from virtually every surrounding adjacent civilization, and that they worship the one who made the stars, all these items in creation, in the skies and the heavens, on earth and just everywhere, all bear the same common fingerprint of the Creator, and that's the one who we worship. So to worship creation is to worship an inferior entity that is perishable. Everything in the universe will not be there forever. So we are, no matter how beautiful it is, we are worshiping that which is designed to decay and perish and have no eternal efficaciousness. So as impressive as the suns and the stars might be, we have to worship the one who made him. So that my heart has been secretly enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand. Remember what he said in verse 4, that he has the faith, the unwavering faith, that everything that he does is numbered and known in the heavens. So he knows that sin is sneaky, and there's sins of the heart, and if you harbor lust in your heart, it's not as morally reprehensible as the act of adultery, but is the moral equivalent. So sin is sneaky. We can sin in our hearts, sin in our spirits, and the definition of integrity is what people do what someone does when no one is looking. And if you are in the practice of ogling women with your eyes, then the key is the trick to getting away with it would be to not make yourself known, and that's if that's your thing. And mouth has kissed my hand. Kissing was a symbol of worship in the ancient Near East. That's what they did. That too is a punishable wickedness, and I would have denied El above. Punishable wickedness, in some sense, all wickedness deserves punishment, but some wickedness is inescapably, justifiably punishable and deserves wrathful retribution. Some things, there would be no cosmic justice if someone could live and get away with some of the things that Job wasn't indulging in. But the punishable wickedness. Now he did not claim to be sinless, but neither did he confess to having lived as a sinner, and that's what invited this devastation, calamity, and ruin upon him. But he, at all hazard and health, and no matter the circumstance or the obstacles, he was, to his credit, he did not deny El above. He did not blaspheme him. He did not curse him. He did not deny him. He just felt a little thing missing. He felt that Elohim had denied him, forsaken him, but he does eventually. Now, in between the appearance and Job's final speech, what we'll end with today are the words of Elihu. He is a younger observer who latches on to the debate and adds his 2 cents until the 37th chapter. Then Job gets his requested audience with Yahweh, and of course it's nothing like he expects. If I have rejoiced when he who hated me was ruined, or lifted myself up when evil found him. The principle of loving one's enemies, there is a misnomer that it is a radical New Testament doctrine, but it is alive and embedded in the Old Testament as well, also Proverbs 24 and 25, and somewhere in 1 Chronicles. But what Job is saying here is that he had no sadistic delight when those who hated him were ruined, and he didn't hate them back, because that's what someone who hates them, they would delight and rejoice in the fact that they had gotten their just deserts, or just exalted oneself on the ashes of another, lift yourself up while others are down. These are things that he did not do. These would have been things that the natural man would ordinarily do. But this is something that Job, now the principle of loving one's enemies, those who hate you, bless those who curse you, revile you, hate you, and insult you, and persecute you. Sermon of the Mount also, you have heard, you must love others, but love your friends, but hate your enemies. And this I say, love your enemies. And greater love hath no man than this, than he should lay down his life for his friends. But are not friends also loving? Are not sinners also loving to their friends? Who did he lay his life down for? The answer to that is found in the 5th chapter of the book of Romans. The wicked, sinners, and enemies. So that's love that you can't match. Love for enemies. Also, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for a curse on his life. The practice of imprecatory prayer, this is when you sincerely request for curses to befall on the enemies, and that is something that is is almost alien to the Christian experience. But when we read the book of Psalms, we find plenty of imprecatory prayers, and these were not unrighteous prayers. They were honest, and that there was the survival of Israel and the messianic line was paramount and put it on the life. So it was appropriate for David and others to cast curse on the lives. But David was a warrior. Job was just a sheep herder and a businessman and a devoted disciple and worshiper. But when all others would have cursed, he blessed. If the men of my tent did not say, who is there that has not been satisfied with his meat? The stranger did not have to spend the night in the street, for I have opened my doors to the way. So he provides hospitality and provision of food to wandering people. There were no motels, so Job would have opened his home to any traveler, and he would have provided them with food and shelter and everything else. The stranger, he didn't have to know you. He would take you in just as an act of faith, rather than have you sleep on the street, because there were no motels as we know them to speak of. Ancient travelers were reliant and dependent on the hospitality of people they knew in the cities they expected to travel, and that is the way that the disciples, when they are commissioned, the 12, are expected to live. Take up your homes and bring your blessing of peace on those who wish you peace, but cast your dust, the dust off your sandals to those who reject you, cities and families. If I have covered my transgression like Adam, by hiding my wickedness in my bosom, hiding sins, now the object of sin, and no sinner is so stupid as to allow to advertise their sinful nature. They try and downplay it. They treat it as less than it really is, and they tell themselves they didn't do it. And there's all sorts of ways and mind mazes that we can put ourselves into, and we cover our tracks. A lot of people cover a lie by protecting it with another lie, so they're just adding webs and layers to the sins. So the covering of our sins is really a nest and a trap, a web, which we ourselves plant. But Adam, what did he do when he sinned? He tried to cover. He became aware that he was naked, and the first thing he did was sew clothes for himself out of fig leaves, and so that term expiation, with the sacrifice for a covering, originates from Genesis 3:21. But hiding the wickedness in the heart, now you can be the danger and challenge of being guilty of spiritual sin is that they emanate from the heart, and we can hide the wickedness in our heart. We can harbor this judgmentality that is unloving towards sinners in our hearts, and that is a sin in itself that is less easily noticed by the one who harbors the hatred in their heart than the sinners that they hate and pretending to hate the sin. Then let me fear the great crowd and dread the scorn of clans. Then I would be silent and go out the door. So this is the consequence and the just response that he accepts, and he would gladly say that if he had this sin, then let me just be torn over to a violent crowd, a mob passion, a mob frenzy, and let all the clans, all the leaders, all the tribes just be aligned against me. And then I would shut up, and I would admit that I was wrong, and I would leave if I've ever done these things. But Job is fighting to the tail end, and he does get his final breath in the 40th verse. We're almost there. Who would give me a hearing? See my signature. Let El Shaddai answer me, and let my accuser write an account. He knows that no earthly power can rectify his justice, can restore his property, or vindicate him of any sin. So that he's not getting the audience, or he's not recognizing the authority of the court of his three comforters. They're the ones giving him a hearing, but he's submitting to El Shaddai, God Almighty, his signature. That's putting his stamp and his approval and his signature, transferring over, and the word, his case to him. So he's ready to go. He's done the paperwork. He is at, it is all in your court now, El Shaddai, I cede it to you. And the word accuser is not identical to the term Satan, which does translate as alternately as adversary or accuser. Would I not take it up on my shoulder, bind it on me for a crown. He would bear the burden of the own consequence. He accepts as just any calamity that is in proportion to the sin that he has committed. Job may have committed a sin or two here or there, but he did not struggle with it as does the ordinary man of average righteousness does. But he felt overburdened, because the burden was more than he could bear, just losing your health, your wealth, your family, your livestock, your houses, your property, your prestige, your standing in the twinkle of an eye. It really puts things all into perspective. I would declare to him the number of my steps. I would approach him like a prince. The practice of wayward princes being able to petition or approach their kings in ways that he was not. This is a statement of presumption on Job's part. He claims a familiarity that just isn't there. He knows that he exists, but he has not seen him, and he does not see him until he descends in the whirlwind. But he's just saying he would know what to say. He would have his case, and he would be in and out. It would be smooth sailing, start to finish. He would lay it on the line. He would say, and his logic would be unassailable, and his conclusions irresistible by the omniscient one. So he's assured of his own vindication, and he gets a rude awakening when the judge descends in the whirlwind. He argues from the vantage point of might is right, saying, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? If you do not know these things, then who are you to question my moral judgments? So he does not ultimately explain the suffering to Job, but he does reward him. But he is a God of promises and not explanations. We are saved by his promises and not his explanations. He doesn't owe us an explanation, although it is not unrighteous of you to request an explanation that might solidify your faith, but just be prepared to be refused or to have an answer that's going to shock you or disturb you. If my land cries out against me, or its furrows weep together, if I have eaten its fruit without payment, or caused the owner to die, let thistles grow instead of wheat, and useless weeds instead of barley. The words of Job are ended. These are the final 3 verses. So if his land now, there was sinning against the land, and one of the ways that the covenant nation of Israel did this was by not observing or honoring the Sabbath year. This was the 7-year cycle whereby the agricultural ground was to remain fallow so it could replenish itself over a longer duration than it otherwise could. And there were 70 of them from the time of Joshua to Jeremiah, and that 70 determined the length of their exile. But Job speaking, if I've let the land or anyone in it or the entire world cry out against me, if I have stolen any fruit, if I have fed myself at another's unwitting expense, if I have not earned everything I've ever eaten, or inflicted harm or devastation or injury on any owner of anything that does not belong to me, then let my agricultural output be accursed. Let thistles grow instead of wheat, and weeds instead of barley. Wheat and barley are the 2 things you want, but he's praying that thistles and weeds will grow rather than them if he is not vindicated. So he has an ironclad certainty, and that's how he closes it. Start to finish, Job knows that he may have done some wrong, but he did no wrong to deserve this, and that's what he can't quite figure out. So that was a long burst of wind from Job, the 26th through the 31st chapter. We next hear from Elihu, who is a more junior member than any of the prior comforters. He's a spectator and observer. So we don't know who was there or how many days this debate took across, but we can plausibly speculate that Elihu was an observer at this great debate, and he chimed in after Job said this. And he takes issue. He is, to his credit, fair with both of them. He criticizes both of them. We'll get to that at a later date. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.